It was an unusually bright morning when Dr. John Watson met his companion, Sherlock Holmes, at the London railway station. The year was 1895, and their latest adventure was taking them to Moscow, a city of historical grandeur, political intrigue, and, of course, a place that had recently been marred by whispers of espionage. Holmes had received an anonymous letter just days before, asking for his assistance in solving a delicate mystery, one that was said to involve a high-stakes political figure from the Russian Empire. However, before embarking on that investigation, Holmes had chosen to board the international train to Moscow for reasons of his own. As Watson approached Holmes, who was standing by the platform, his mind was already preoccupied with the strange case. Holmes, with his sharp features and calculating gaze, stood motionless, his eyes scanning the crowds with the precision of a hawk. He did not look up when Watson greeted him. "Ah, Watson, you are here. We should make haste." "The train departs shortly," Holmes said without turning. His voice was steady, yet it carried an underlying urgency. Watson nodded but could not shake the sense of unease that had settled in his stomach. There was something strange about Holmes's demeanor that day, something more than just his usual intense focus. He had not spoken much since receiving the letter, and though Watson had asked several times, Holmes had said little about the nature of their trip. The two men boarded the train, a sleek and luxurious carriage that would take them across Europe to their final destination. Holmes led the way, his long strides quick and purposeful. Watson, slightly behind, observed the passengers. The train was bustling with activity, as well-to-do businessmen, diplomats, and other travelers made their way to their assigned seats. Holmes and Watson entered their compartment, a small but comfortable space furnished with plush seats and wood-paneled walls. They settled into the seats by the window, the rhythmic sound of the train's wheels on the tracks creating a peaceful, almost hypnotic atmosphere. Watson glanced at his companion, who was already lost in thought, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the various passengers on the train. His mind was undoubtedly working on some puzzle or theory that Watson could not yet comprehend. It was then that Watson noticed her. The girl. At first, Watson had thought little of her. She was sitting in the compartment across from them, and like many passengers, she appeared to be lost in her own world. She was young, perhaps no older than 20, dressed in a thick, dark cloak despite the warmth of the early summer day. Her eyes were wide and alert, constantly darting from side to side as if searching for something or someone. Holmes noticed her too. His gaze flicked over to the girl, his sharp eyes registering every detail. Unlike Watson, Holmes did not simply glance at the girl. He observed her with an intensity that left no room for error. He studied her mannerisms, the way she fidgeted with the hem of her cloak, the tension in her posture, and most of all, the way she seemed to be avoiding eye contact with the man sitting a few rows ahead of her. Watson, curious but not entirely suspicious, leaned closer to Holmes and whispered, "Do you think something is amiss with the girl?" Holmes's eyes never left the young woman. "There is something, Watson. I've been watching her for the past several minutes, and I've observed several things. First, she appears anxious, though she is doing her best to mask it. Second, she has been avoiding the gaze of the man seated a few rows ahead. I cannot be certain, but I believe she feels threatened by him." Watson glanced at the man in question, a middle-aged individual dressed in a gray suit and dark hat, his face partially obscured by a newspaper. He had been glancing at the girl intermittently, but each time he did so, he quickly looked away when she seemed to notice. Watson saw nothing particularly unusual about him, yet Holmes's keen observation told a different story. "Perhaps she's simply shy or anxious about traveling," Watson offered. Still not fully convinced, Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson. This is not the behavior of a simple, nervous traveler. There is something far more sinister at play here. Watch closely." Just as Holmes spoke, the girl abruptly stood up, her movements jerky and quick as though something had startled her. She walked swiftly toward the door of the compartment, then hesitated as if unsure whether to leave. Her eyes scanned the surroundings, and for a moment, Holmes and Watson both saw the brief flicker of panic in her expression. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "I believe it's time for us to investigate further, Watson. Follow my lead." With that, Holmes stood up and moved towards the door as well, his footsteps light and almost imperceptible. Watson, his curiosity piqued, followed closely behind. The two men quietly exited the compartment and stood in the narrow hallway of the train, watching the girl from a distance. She had stopped in front of a compartment several doors down, hesitating as she seemed to listen for something. Her breath was shallow and she placed her hand against the doorframe as if steadying herself. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "She is about to meet someone," he muttered. A few moments later, the door to the compartment opened and an older man stepped out. His appearance was unremarkable, save for the sharpness in his eyes which seemed to betray a life of hard experience. He glanced briefly at the girl and she seemed to visibly relax, though her tension never fully left. Holmes's eyes flicked from the man to the girl, taking in every detail. The man's demeanor was calm, but Holmes noticed the faintest flicker of something, perhaps recognition or even suspicion, pass between them. The girl spoke quietly to the man, her voice low and urgent. Holmes could not hear the words but could make out her body language. She was pleading, her shoulders tense, and her hands clasped tightly before her. Holmes stepped closer to the edge of the hallway, trying to overhear. As he did, he caught a fragment of the conversation, just enough to make his blood run cold. "Why are you following me?" The girl's voice trembled. "You promised you'd leave me alone." "I can't go back." "I can't." The man's response was inaudible, but Holmes could see the cold, measured expression on his face as he took a step closer to her. She recoiled, though her eyes never left his. The man spoke again, though his voice was still too soft for Watson to hear. Then in a quick motion, the man grabbed the girl by the arm. She flinched but did not cry out. Instead, she nodded, her face pale but resigned. The man gave a curt nod, and the girl, though visibly shaking, followed him down the hallway toward the dining car. Watson turned to Holmes, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who are they? What is happening?" Holmes's expression was grim. "I do not know yet, Watson, but I have a feeling that we are about to be involved in something far more complicated than a simple case of a frightened girl. This is no ordinary interaction. That man is following her and she is not seeking refuge. She is running from something, or perhaps someone." Before Watson could respond, Holmes's mind was already at work, calculating and theorizing with lightning speed. He glanced down the corridor to where the girl and the man had disappeared into the dining car. His thoughts raced. Could they be part of a larger conspiracy? Were they entangled in something criminal, or perhaps something far more dangerous? Holmes's eyes met Watson's. "We shall follow them, Watson. It is time to discover just who we are dealing with." Watson hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Lead the way, Holmes." The two men set off down the corridor, their footsteps quiet, their hearts beating faster as they moved toward the unknown. The rhythmic sound of the train wheels clattering against the tracks continued, like the beating of an ancient heart. The carriage swayed gently as it made its way through the European countryside. Holmes and Watson, having followed the girl and the older man to the dining car, had taken seats at a quiet corner table, feigning casualness as they kept their eyes trained on the two figures. Holmes, though seemingly detached, was not one to miss a single detail, and Watson, though increasingly curious and concerned, trusted in his friend's instincts. "I find it odd," Watson said, his voice low, "that we are still unable to hear what they are saying. They have taken their seats at the far end of the car, yet they speak in such hushed tones." Holmes, without shifting his gaze, gave a small, knowing smile. "Indeed, Watson, they have chosen to speak quietly, but I have seen enough. The girl is not simply nervous, she is desperate, and that man, though outwardly calm, is hiding something. His every movement suggests that he's aware of her fear, and he is determined to keep her from fleeing." Watson shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the sense of danger that seemed to fill the air. But why would he be following her? And where is she running to? The girl we saw earlier, her eyes. I don't believe she's the type to be mixed up in anything criminal. Holmes finally turned his head toward Watson, his sharp gaze piercing through the dim light of the dining car. "That is precisely what makes this case intriguing, Watson. People seldom act as they seem. Look closely at the girl. Her hands tremble not with fear alone, but with the burden of a secret. And that man, the one she so obviously wishes to avoid, is not a stranger. They share an unsettling familiarity. It is a matter of time before we learn the truth behind their connection." As Holmes spoke, his attention briefly flickered toward the pair across the dining car. The older man, whom Watson had begun to think of as the stranger, was now speaking with the girl more intently. She seemed to protest in quiet, hurried tones, her body tense. The man, however, remained unruffled, his demeanor controlled, even condescending. From this distance it was hard to make out the exact words, but Holmes's trained ear was able to catch a few phrases. "I told you not to run. It's too late for that. The plan's already in motion." The girl's voice, though faint, reached Holmes and Watson. "I had no choice. If I stay, though—" But before she could finish, the man leaned forward, placing a hand on her wrist with a firmness that startled Watson. She recoiled instinctively, but he held his ground. Holmes's eyes flickered. "That's it, Watson. They're involved in something far more dangerous than we first assumed. She's part of something she can't escape. And now it seems she's trying to leave, perhaps even turn her back on whoever she was working for." Watson, who had been watching intently, could not suppress his curiosity. But why would someone like her be involved in such matters? She's so young and frightened. She could be a pawn in something bigger, but surely there must be more to her story. Holmes nodded, his lips pursed as he glanced at Watson. "Indeed, Watson. This case is becoming more perplexing by the moment. We must bide our time, but we'll need to get closer, observe them more intimately. I have a hunch that a confrontation is near." As the meal was served, Holmes and Watson remained quiet, the atmosphere in the dining car humming with the soft clinking of plates and murmured conversations. The older man and the girl continued their tense exchange, though their words remained elusive. The longer they watched, the more Watson's unease grew. The girl's demeanor was that of someone trapped, someone whose every decision was dictated by forces outside her control. Watson could see her fingers gripping the edge of the table, as though she sought something to steady herself. Every time the older man spoke, she flinched ever so slightly. Finally, Holmes stood, excusing himself in his usual manner. "Come, Watson, let us take a short walk. The air in here is a little too thick for my liking." Watson followed his friend into the adjoining corridor. The two moved quietly past the other compartments, their footsteps almost inaudible. Once out of earshot of the dining car, Holmes turned to Watson, his voice low but firm. "We shall act, Watson. I am convinced that the girl is in grave danger. We have learned enough from our observations to take a more direct approach. But what of the man?" Watson asked, a hint of caution in his tone. "He could be dangerous." Holmes's eyes glinted with excitement. "That's exactly why we must engage him. I suspect he's not the only one involved. We need to learn who he represents, what his objective is, and whether the girl's disappearance is truly voluntary." The train was nearing a small, isolated station, somewhere deep in the Russian countryside, when Holmes made his move. They had returned to their compartment, only to find that the girl and the older man had vanished. The train's staff had reported that the two had left the dining car some time ago, but no one had seen where they had gone. Holmes's eyes flicked over the passengers and the crew, as if measuring the distance between each of them and their surroundings. His gaze fell on a conductor walking by, and he quickly stopped him. "Pardon me, sir," Holmes said in his most authoritative tone. "Could you inform me when the next stop is? I'd like to know if the train is expected to make any delays or detours." The conductor glanced up, a little startled by the abruptness of the question, but nodded. "We will be stopping in a few minutes at a small station near the border. It's a scheduled stop for a few minutes, but we won't be there long." Holmes's mind raced. He glanced at Watson, whose eyes mirrored his growing concern. "We must act quickly, Watson. I believe they are making a move now, a move that will take them far beyond our reach unless we act swiftly." At the small station, the train made a brief stop, its wheels screeching against the rails. The light outside was dimming and the air was cold with the approach of evening. Holmes and Watson alighted quickly, blending with the passengers as they hurried to disembark. Holmes's keen eyes searched the platform. At first there was no sign of the girl or the older man. But then, just as they were about to board a waiting carriage to continue their journey, Holmes caught sight of the girl. She was standing at the edge of the platform, her back turned toward them. Her cloak was drawn tight and she appeared to be speaking to someone in the shadows, her voice barely audible. Watson moved closer, his heart pounding with anxiety. He could see the figure of the older man emerging from the shadows, his face obscured by the fading light. "Holmes, we must act now," Watson said, his hand instinctively moving to his pocket where his revolver was concealed. Holmes placed a calming hand on Watson's arm. "Patience, Watson. This is the moment of truth. We must allow them to make the first move." The girl's voice rose slightly, almost inaudible against the backdrop of distant train whistles. "I don't want to do this anymore." "I can't keep running." The man's reply was measured, cold. "You don't have a choice." At that moment, Holmes moved swiftly, his instincts sharp and precise. He approached the two figures, his presence known but not yet acknowledged. Watson followed closely behind. "Excuse me, sir," Holmes called out, his voice calm and clear. The older man turned quickly, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. The girl flinched at the sound of Holmes's voice, as though she had been caught in the act of something forbidden. "I'm afraid we cannot allow you to proceed any further," Holmes said, his tone unwavering. "There is a matter of great importance we need to discuss immediately." The man stood still, assessing Holmes. For a moment there was silence. Then the older man smiled, a thin, unsettling smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I don't believe you know what you're dealing with, Mr. Holmes," the man replied coolly. Holmes's eyes flickered briefly before he responded. "On the contrary, I believe I know exactly what I'm dealing with." And just like that, the game had begun. The train's wheels hummed steadily beneath the floor of their compartment, the rhythmic clatter acting as a constant reminder of the path they were taking through the shadowed European night. The sharpness of Holmes's deduction still echoed in Watson's mind. But as they settled back into their compartment after their brief encounter with the girl and the older man, a feeling of unease had crept over him, growing stronger with each passing moment. He glanced over at his friend, who had become unusually silent, his sharp eyes fixed on the passing landscape outside the window. The dusky light from the lanterns on the platform had long since disappeared, and the train now seemed a dark, enclosed world hurtling toward an unknown destination. Watson shifted uneasily in his seat, trying to ignore the discomfort gnawing at his insides. Holmes had been increasingly preoccupied, his every movement precise, his thoughts apparently racing far ahead of Watson's understanding. The entire encounter with the girl and the older man had left Watson with more questions than answers. "So," Watson began tentatively, his voice breaking the silence, "we know the girl is running from something, perhaps something dangerous, and the man, well, he doesn't seem to be a mere traveler, does he? But why would she seek refuge in such a place as this on a train bound for Moscow?" Holmes's gaze never wavered from the passing scenery, but his lips twitched almost imperceptibly. "Ah, Watson," he said quietly, "you've already asked the right question, though you've only scratched the surface. The girl may be a pawn in something far more elaborate than we could have guessed. But what troubles me most is this: I fear she has vanished." Watson frowned. "Vanished?" Holmes's eyes flicked toward him. "Indeed, and not by accident, Watson. We must consider that she may have chosen to disappear on her own, or perhaps she has been taken." At that, Watson stiffened. "Taken by whom?" Holmes's sharp eyes pierced the gloom of the compartment as he settled back into his seat. "I cannot say for certain, but my instincts tell me this is no mere flight from danger. It's something far more orchestrated. She did not seem to act alone. She was in contact with forces far beyond her control. The minutes seemed to stretch on like hours, and the train sped toward its next stop, a small village on the outskirts of Russia. As Holmes had predicted, the girl and the man had disappeared into the night, leaving no trace. Holmes's face, usually so composed, was now set in an expression of tense contemplation. The train slowed and a bell rang out, signaling the arrival at the next stop. It was then that the conductor came by, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted his cap. "Excuse me, gentlemen," the conductor began, his voice strained. "There's something strange going on with one of our compartments. A woman has gone missing." Holmes sat up straighter, his curiosity piqued. "Missing? In what way?" The conductor hesitated. "I'm afraid I'm not sure, sir. It seems that a young lady traveling alone has vanished from her compartment. It was the compartment just next to yours. We've searched the carriages, but there's no sign of her. It's as though she's simply disappeared. Did anyone see her leave?" Watson asked, his voice edged with concern. "No, sir," the conductor replied. "No one saw anything, and the door to her compartment was locked from the inside. It wasn't until we went to check on her that we realized she was gone. There's no sign of struggle, no trace of any kind." Holmes's mind was already whirring, piecing together the new information. The girl, the same one they had observed earlier, was gone, and yet it made no sense. She had appeared so desperate, so determined to escape, and now, after their confrontation with the man, she had vanished. But how and why? Holmes stood quickly, his gaze sharp as he made his way toward the door. "Watson, we must act quickly. I believe we have more questions than answers, but we cannot let this opportunity slip by." Watson, feeling the weight of the situation, followed his friend. "Holmes, do you think—" "I think the girl is in more danger than we could have imagined," Holmes interrupted, his tone grim. "But we will not solve this by standing idle. The man we encountered earlier, the one she was with, he's involved in something far darker than mere travel, and we have to uncover what it is before it's too late." The two men made their way down the long, dimly lit hallway of the train, their footsteps echoing in the otherwise quiet train car. They reached the compartment where the girl had been, and Holmes immediately began examining the door, his eyes scanning the frame and the lock. Watson stood behind him, watching as Holmes worked with the practiced precision of someone used to solving mysteries with the smallest of clues. "It's odd," Holmes muttered as he examined the door. "The lock hasn't been tampered with, and the door was locked from the inside. Yet there's no sign of the girl." He paused, and his sharp eyes flicked over to Watson. "Watson, I suspect this is not as simple as it seems. Someone has orchestrated her disappearance, and I believe the older man, the one who was with her, is at the center of it." "But how?" Watson asked. "How could he have taken her without anyone noticing? This train is bustling with people." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "A clever trick, Watson. A diversion. It would not be the first time a disappearance was arranged under the cover of night and chaos." And the girl's fear, she was already prepared to leave. She did not resist when the man approached her. She may have been led into a trap. Watson's stomach churned as he realized the implications of Holmes's words. The girl, whom they had tried so desperately to help, had now disappeared without a trace. And the man they had encountered, the one who had held her so forcefully, was involved in something much larger than a simple chase. It was then that Holmes paused, his sharp eyes alighting on something just beside the doorframe, something Watson had not noticed at first. A faint mark on the wood barely visible under the dim light. "What's this?" Holmes murmured, kneeling to get a closer look. Watson leaned in, his curiosity piqued. It was a small, almost imperceptible indentation in the wood, as though something had been pressed against it with great force. Holmes ran his fingers lightly over the mark as if trying to decipher its meaning. "I believe we've found our first clue," Holmes said with quiet certainty. The mark was not natural. It was too precise, too deliberate. Holmes's mind worked furiously, and then it clicked. The indentation was made by a small, narrow object, a key perhaps. But not just any key, a special one, designed to unlock doors without leaving a trace. "Watson," Holmes said, standing up and dusting off his trousers, "I believe the girl didn't disappear at all. She was taken by someone who knew exactly how to do it. And that person, my dear Watson, is the man who we saw earlier." Watson's heart raced. "But how do we find them? We're on a train that's speeding across the continent." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "The answers lie in the next stop, Watson, and I believe we have very little time." As the train continued its journey, Holmes and Watson spent the next hour carefully examining the train and speaking to other passengers. No one seemed to know anything about the girl's disappearance, and the staff, though concerned, were equally baffled. It was as if she had simply vanished from the face of the earth. Holmes was quiet, his brow furrowed as he mulled over the facts. His instincts told him that there was something larger at play, something far beyond the ordinary. The girl, the man, and the key, it was all part of a grander scheme, and it was up to Holmes to unravel it. Finally, they arrived at the next stop, a small village near the border. As the train came to a halt, Holmes and Watson hurried off, their minds set on one goal, to find the girl and learn the truth behind her disappearance. But as they stepped onto the platform, Holmes's expression darkened. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the air, the unmistakable sense that they were being watched. And then, in the distance, Holmes caught sight of a figure disappearing into the fog. The train was now moving through the Russian countryside, its rhythmic clatter on the tracks the only sound to accompany Holmes and Watson's thoughts. The brisk wind blew through the open window, rattling the thin curtains, but Holmes remained as composed as ever. His eyes, always watchful, never seemed to rest, constantly scanning the horizon as though searching for something just beyond the reach of the present. Watson, who had been silently observing his friend, could sense the palpable tension in the air. The girl was still missing, her disappearance as baffling as it was troubling. Every passing moment seemed to draw them further away from the truth, and yet Holmes had been unusually quiet since their encounter at the station. He had observed the faint mark near the doorframe of the compartment, and it had set his mind alight with questions he had yet to answer. The two had returned to their compartment after the brief stop, but even as they settled into their seats, it was clear that something was at play that was far beyond their initial assumptions. Holmes had spoken little, but his thoughts were undoubtedly racing. Watson couldn't help but wonder how much more there was to this mystery, this web they seemed to be entangled in. Holmes's voice suddenly broke the silence. "Watson, I've been thinking." Watson raised an eyebrow. "About the girl?" Holmes turned his piercing gaze toward his companion. "Yes, and about the key. The one we found in her compartment. It's no ordinary key. That mark, faint as it was, indicates something far more complex. And I believe it's a message, though not one we are meant to understand immediately." "What do you mean?" Watson asked, leaning forward, his curiosity piqued. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his long fingers steepled in front of him. "The indentation on the doorframe, it's too deliberate to be a mere accident. Someone used that key to open the door without disturbing the lock. But why? What was behind this subtlety? I believe the key was not only used to unlock the door but also to send a signal, a message, if you will. And I suspect that message is part of a larger scheme, one that dates back further than we can imagine." Watson looked at him, perplexed. "A message from the past? You're suggesting that all of this, her disappearance, the strange man, the key, is somehow connected to events long before we boarded this train?" Holmes nodded, his eyes glinting with a mix of intrigue and certainty. "Exactly, Watson. And if I am correct, then we are dealing with something that has its roots in a hidden history, perhaps even one linked to espionage, political maneuvering, and betrayal. But there is more, Watson, a piece of the puzzle that we are missing. I need to get my hands on more information. Something tells me that the girl's disappearance is not only about her, but about a much greater game that we are only beginning to understand." Holmes's words hung in the air as Watson absorbed their weight. The idea that the girl's disappearance might be part of a much older plot left Watson with an uncomfortable feeling in the pit of his stomach. He glanced at Holmes, whose gaze had once again returned to the window, as though watching the world pass by, but at the same time, examining every detail that no one else could see. As the train continued its journey, the landscape outside became more barren, the dark outlines of distant forests and hills adding to the feeling of isolation. Watson's thoughts wandered back to the strange man, the one who had been with the girl. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had only uncovered the tip of the iceberg, and the deeper they went, the more dangerous this situation would become. "Holmes," Watson said after a long silence, "what do we do next? We've already made our move, but we don't even know where to start looking for the girl. How do we continue?" Holmes's gaze shifted slightly, his eyes flickering toward Watson for just a moment before turning back to the window. "I believe, Watson, that the answer lies with the key. The mark we found wasn't random. It was meant to guide us to the next piece of the puzzle. But it's not a physical object we need to find. The key is symbolic, and if I am not mistaken, someone is attempting to keep us from uncovering its meaning." Watson frowned. "You mean someone deliberately wants us to fail? Why?" Holmes turned to face him fully now, his expression intense. "Because there are people who are willing to go to great lengths to protect what lies hidden. Whoever the girl is, and I suspect she's more than just a victim in this, has knowledge that could shake the very foundation of the operation. That's why they're hiding her. That's why the girl is running. But how does that fit into the larger picture?" Watson asked, still struggling to piece the elements together. Holmes sighed, his eyes narrowing as he mentally traced the steps of the investigation. "We've only seen part of the story. The man she was with, he's not just a pursuer, Watson. He's a key player in a much broader network. And I believe that network reaches into the heart of Europe, perhaps even beyond. We are only scratching the surface of what they are truly after." The train continued its journey, its destination still hours away. Yet for all their progress, Holmes had a deep sense of urgency. He had a theory forming in his mind, but it was still too fragile, too incomplete to share. His instinct was always to follow the smallest clue, the faintest whisper of truth, and it was this relentless pursuit that had led him down so many tangled paths before. Now, once again, he found himself at the center of a web that was far more intricate than it had initially appeared. He glanced at Watson, who had been silent for some time, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. "You're thinking about the girl, aren't you?" Holmes said suddenly. Watson looked up, startled. "Yes, I can't help but wonder how she's faring." "What if—" Holmes cut him off with a gesture, his voice calm but resolute. "Watson, we must keep our focus. The girl's fate is important, but the larger question is what forces are at play here. This is not just a simple case of kidnapping. We are dealing with something far more insidious, and it's imperative that we don't let ourselves be distracted by emotions." Watson nodded, though he couldn't help the flicker of unease that lingered in his chest. "I understand, but what if we're too late? What if we can't stop whatever is coming next?" Holmes's face softened just for a moment. "We are not too late, Watson. Not yet, but we must act swiftly. The game is already in motion. If we are to uncover the truth, we must follow the trail wherever it leads, no matter how dangerous it may become." As the evening wore on, the train stopped at another small station. Holmes and Watson disembarked, their minds fully engaged in the puzzle before them. The chill of the Russian air bit at their skin, but it did little to deter them. They had one objective now: to find the girl, to learn who was behind her disappearance, and to understand the role of the key in this tangled web. Holmes had a feeling that the next step in their investigation would take them deeper into the past. Something about the key, the mark on the doorframe, and the man's cryptic words spoke of secrets long buried. The girl was not merely running from someone. She was running toward something, and it was up to Holmes to uncover it before time ran out. As they moved further from the station, Holmes paused, his sharp eyes catching something in the distance. A figure standing by a carriage seemed to be waiting for them. Watson noticed it too. "Who is that?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "I believe our mysterious adversary has just made his move." The figure was tall, with an air of familiarity, and as they approached, Holmes's suspicions were confirmed. The man had an unsettling calmness about him, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He appeared to be waiting patiently for Holmes and Watson to arrive. "Holmes," Watson muttered. "Do you know him?" Holmes's eyes studied the figure intently. "I do, Watson. This man is no stranger. He is a key player in the events unfolding, and he's the one who holds the answers we need." The man turned as they approached, his face betraying no emotion. "Mr. Holmes," the man said, his voice cold and precise, "I've been expecting you." The air was thick with the scent of pine and the distant hum of a rickety train that seemed to echo through the landscape as the evening descended upon the Russian countryside. Holmes and Watson stood silently on the platform, eyeing the man who had been waiting for them, his presence as enigmatic as the case itself. His tall frame was stiff, his expression unreadable, yet there was something profoundly unsettling in the way he regarded them. Watson took a step closer to Holmes, his voice barely above a whisper. "Holmes, do you know him?" Holmes's gaze never wavered from the man as he responded, his tone low but firm. "Yes, Watson, I know him. But it is not so much about who he is but what he represents." He paused, narrowing his eyes, his mind already working through the implications. "I suspect that he holds the answers to much of this mystery. We must proceed cautiously." The man, standing at the far end of the station platform, did not approach, but neither did he retreat. His stance was one of stillness, waiting for them to make the next move. Holmes, in his typical fashion, stepped forward first, leading the way with an air of deliberate nonchalance. "Good evening," Holmes called out, his voice cutting through the cool evening air. "I believe you have been waiting for us." The man's lips twitched into a faint smile. It was not warm, but it was measured, like a man who had seen far too many such moments to be taken by surprise. "You've been making quite the impression on my associates." "Mr. Holmes," the man said smoothly, his voice deep and carrying an edge of authority, "I've heard much about you, but I think you have misunderstood the nature of this pursuit." Holmes did not flinch, his eyes sharp. "I don't believe I have misunderstood anything. It's quite clear that we are involved in something far more intricate than it initially appeared. You, sir, are a part of a larger network, and I believe you are here to stop us from uncovering the truth." The man's eyes darkened slightly, though his expression remained composed. "You're correct in one thing, Mr. Holmes. I am here to stop you. But not for the reasons you think." He paused, almost as if weighing his words carefully. "You're meddling in something that doesn't concern you. The girl you're chasing, she is of no consequence. She was never meant to be found." At the mention of the girl, Watson felt a shiver of unease pass through him. He had long suspected that there was more to her than just an innocent victim, caught in the midst of some nefarious plot. But hearing it now from the man who had been so calm throughout the investigation only deepened the mystery. Holmes, however, was not so easily deterred. His eyes remained steady, and his voice carried the confidence of someone who had heard the same cryptic statements 1,000 times before. If she's of no consequence, then why the elaborate ruse? Why the careful planning? Why the disappearance? The man sighed, his gaze flickering toward the train station in the distance. Because she was never meant to be found, Mr. Holmes. She was a pawn in a game far beyond her comprehension, just as you are now. Holmes's expression hardened. And what game might that be? The man's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no humor in it. A game of power. A game that has been in play for years. The girl was a part of something bigger than herself, something she could not escape. She knew too much, Mr. Holmes, and that knowledge is dangerous. He looked directly at Holmes, his voice lowering. You should have stayed out of this. For a moment there was a silence between them, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Watson could feel it pressing against him, suffocating him. He glanced at Holmes, whose face remained impassive, but the tension in his shoulders was palpable. Finally, Holmes spoke again, his voice cutting through the thickening air like a knife. I've never been one to back down from a challenge, especially not when innocent lives are at stake. If you're implying that the girl is merely a casualty of this game you speak of, then you're gravely mistaken. I intend to uncover the full extent of what's happening here, and I intend to stop it. The man's eyes narrowed, the cold smile fading into something far more serious. You can try, Mr. Holmes, but some forces are not meant to be opposed. The people involved in this, they are not to be trifled with. I advise you to leave this matter alone. Holmes stepped closer, his voice now a mere whisper. Tell me everything and perhaps I will consider it. The man hesitated, and for the first time a flicker of uncertainty passed through his eyes. It was brief, but Holmes caught it. He could see that the man was torn between revealing the truth and keeping his cards close to his chest. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the man spoke. Very well, Mr. Holmes, you forced my hand. He looked around, making sure no one was within earshot. The girl you've been searching for was once part of a secret network. A network that operated under the radar for years. She had access to information, files, documents, things that could change the course of history. Holmes's eyebrows rose. What kind of information? Sensitive intelligence, and the man replied, his voice lowering further. Information that could bring down governments, corporations, entire political regimes. She was never meant to know the full extent of it, but she did. And that's why she had to disappear. Watson frowned, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of this revelation. You mean to say that the girl was a part of some espionage operation? She was involved in something far larger than we had imagined. The man nodded grimly. Precisely. And now, Mr. Holmes, I must warn you once more. This is not a game you want to play. The people she worked for, they are not merciful. They will do whatever it takes to keep their secrets hidden. Holmes remained silent for a moment, processing the information. His sharp mind was already piecing together the puzzle. So the girl was a courier, a bearer of dangerous knowledge. And the man she was with, the one who followed her, is part of this organization. Yes, the man confirmed, his tone reluctant. But it's more than that. The organization has tentacles everywhere, across Europe and Russia and beyond. They control powerful people, people who have the means to make things disappear without a trace. And the girl? She was expendable. Watson felt a deep chill settle over him as he absorbed the weight of the man's words. The girl had been more than just a victim. She had been caught in a storm of espionage and power struggles that spanned the globe. The fact that she was running from the very people who had once employed her only added to the layers of intrigue. Holmes, however, was unfazed. And now she's gone. But you're not telling me everything, are you? There's more to this than just a girl on the run. The man's gaze flickered briefly, but he quickly regained his composure. There's little more to say, Mr. Holmes. She was supposed to die in obscurity. Her disappearance was orchestrated as part of a larger plan, but you've managed to complicate things. Holmes leaned in slightly. Who is behind all this? Who are these people? The man hesitated again, his eyes darting around as if seeking an escape. But there was no easy way out now. He had already revealed too much. It's not just a single group, the man finally said, his voice barely audible. It's a coalition of powerful men, politicians, businessmen, military leaders, all with their own agendas. They want control, and they will stop at nothing to keep it. Holmes's mind was racing, trying to connect the dots. So the girl's knowledge is the key to this entire operation. And now that she's disappeared, someone is pulling the strings to make sure she stays hidden. The man looked resigned. Yes, and they'll do everything in their power to make sure no one ever finds out the truth. Holmes stood still for a moment, digesting this new information. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but it was still unclear who had orchestrated the girl's disappearance, and to what end. Finally, Holmes turned to Watson, his face set in determination. We cannot let this rest, Watson. The truth is far more dangerous than we imagined, and the people behind this, whatever it is, will stop at nothing to keep their secrets. Watson nodded, his expression resolute. So what do we do now? Holmes's eyes glinted with purpose. We continue to search for the girl. We dig deeper. And most importantly, we expose those behind this operation, before they can silence us. The man standing before them gave a cold smile. You may think you're uncovering the truth, Mr. Holmes, but in the end you'll find that the truth has a price, and that price may be more than you're willing to pay. Holmes's gaze never wavered. Then let us see how much we are willing to pay. As Holmes and Watson made their way back to the train, the weight of the mystery they had uncovered hung heavy over them. The truth was more complex and dangerous than they could have imagined, and the stakes had just been raised to a perilous level. But one thing was certain. They would not stop until they had unraveled the full extent of the conspiracy and brought those behind it to justice. The train began to pull out of the station, its wheels churning against the tracks, carrying them further into the heart of the mystery, and as they settled back into their compartment, Holmes's mind was already calculating their next move, because this was only the beginning. The game had changed, and now it was a race against time. The train, now hurtling through the Russian wilderness, seemed to have a mind of its own. The rhythmic clattering of the wheels against the tracks was a constant companion, as Holmes and Watson sat in their compartment, the flickering light of a lantern casting shadows on the wooden walls. Holmes had not spoken much since their encounter with the mysterious man, but Watson could feel the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him, each moment drawing them closer to a revelation, or perhaps a trap. Watson sat back in his seat, staring out of the window at the rapidly passing landscape. His mind was reeling with everything they had learned so far. The girl's mysterious role in a high-stakes game of espionage, the shadowy figures who seemed to be pulling the strings behind the scenes, and the cryptic words of the man they had encountered. Despite the unsettling nature of their investigation, there was one thing Watson was certain of. They were on the right path. The pieces were slowly falling into place, though the full picture remained tantalizingly out of reach. Holmes, ever the picture of focus, had been quietly mulling over the clues they had gathered. The key, the faint mark on the doorframe, and the strange network of powerful men behind the girl's disappearance. They were all connected, but the connection was not yet clear enough for Holmes to act on. He needed more information. We're getting closer, Watson, Holmes said suddenly, his voice low but clear, as if the words had been forming in his mind for some time. But there is still one piece of the puzzle missing. The girl, the man we've encountered, the organization behind them, all of it points to something larger, something that has been in the works for years. Watson turned to look at his companion, his brow furrowing with curiosity. What do you mean, Holmes? What are you suggesting? Holmes's eyes, though tired, were as sharp as ever. The game is much older than we originally thought. These men, this network, they have been in power for decades, pulling strings from behind the scenes. The girl's role was simply one part of a much larger plan. Watson leaned forward, his interest piqued. But how do we uncover the rest of this plan? What do we do next? Holmes's lips curled into a slight smile, the first genuine smile Watson had seen from him in days. The answer, Watson, is in the past. We need to go back, to where it all began. The next few hours passed in relative silence as the train sped deeper into the Russian heartland. The landscape outside the window was barren, stretching endlessly in all directions, the dull gray sky casting a muted light over the fields and forests that seemed to stretch forever. Watson felt a creeping sense of isolation, both from the world around them and from the answers they were so desperately seeking. Finally, as the train neared its next scheduled stop, Holmes stood, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the cabin. He was already preparing for the next stage of their journey, his mind already set on their destination. "Watson," he said, turning toward his companion with a glint of purpose in his eyes, "it's time we pay a visit to someone who knows more about this network than we ever could." Watson's curiosity piqued. "Who are we visiting?" Holmes paused, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his lips. "I've been in contact with an old associate, someone who has ties to this organization. He's someone who will know exactly how deep this web stretches, and he's our only hope of getting the final piece of the puzzle." Watson stood quickly, a sense of urgency overtaking him. "But Holmes, how are we to trust him? How do you know he won't be part of the conspiracy?" Holmes's eyes darkened briefly. "Because he is the one man in all of Europe who has seen the inner workings of this organization firsthand. He's an intelligence officer, one of the few who managed to escape its grasp. If anyone can provide us with the answers we need, it's him." The train came to a halt at a small station nestled at the edge of a dense forest. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and fresh rain, the distant echoes of the train's whistle reverberating through the trees. As Holmes and Watson disembarked, they made their way quickly through the misty evening, their boots crunching softly on the wet gravel. They arrived at a small, weathered cabin on the outskirts of the station. Its simplicity was deceiving. Inside, the man Holmes had been in contact with was waiting for them. A tall, thin figure dressed in a dark overcoat sat by a fire, his sharp eyes glinting in the low light. Holmes wasted no time in exchanging pleasantries. "Sergei," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we need your help." Sergei stood, his face hardening as he looked between Holmes and Watson. "I assumed you would come, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "The question is, are you prepared for what you will uncover?" Holmes nodded, his face set. "We've come too far to turn back now. We need to know everything about the girl, the organization she was involved with, and the role it plays in the larger scheme." Sergei motioned for them to sit. "Very well. But understand this, Holmes. What I'm about to tell you comes with a price. This network, this shadow organization, it's older than you think. It's been pulling strings in Europe for decades, and the people behind it, they are not the type to be underestimated." Holmes leaned forward, his mind already calculating the next steps. "We understand the stakes, but we need to know how to stop them." Sergei's eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and resignation. "You can't stop them, Mr. Holmes. Not without understanding the full scope of their operation. This organization isn't just a group of men, it's a system. It's embedded in every level of power in Europe. You've been chasing shadows, and now those shadows are closing in on you." Holmes's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "Are you suggesting we cannot stop them?" Sergei paused, taking a deep breath. "There's one piece of the puzzle that you're missing. It's the girl. She was never meant to disappear. Her disappearance was orchestrated. But there's a reason for it. She was the key to everything. She knew the final piece of the puzzle, and now she's gone." Watson felt his stomach tighten. "Gone? What do you mean gone?" "We've been searching for her this entire time." Sergei's face softened with regret. "The girl was never just a victim. She was part of the game. She knew too much, and that made her a threat. When she ran, they knew it was only a matter of time before someone like you came looking for her, and now they will do everything in their power to stop you." Holmes's mind raced. He had suspected the girl's role in all of this was far more complex than they had been led to believe. But the confirmation sent a cold shiver down his spine. She was not merely an innocent caught in the crossfire. She had been central to the operation all along. "The final piece," Holmes muttered. "The final piece of the puzzle. What does she know?" Sergei hesitated for a long moment before speaking, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was supposed to meet someone who could help her escape. But the meeting never happened, and now it's too late." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Who was she supposed to meet?" Sergei stood, his hands shaking slightly as he paced the room. "I can't tell you everything, but I will tell you this. The girl wasn't running from just anyone. She was running from the heart of the operation, the people who control everything. And if they catch her..." Watson stood up suddenly, his frustration building. "What do you mean?" "What's going to happen to her?" Sergei's face was grave. "She's the last person who knows the truth. and they'll stop at nothing to make sure she doesn't speak. Her knowledge is too dangerous, and now she's a liability. Holmes turned sharply to Watson, his face set with grim determination. We have to find her now, but Sergei's voice halted them. If you continue, Mr. Holmes, you risk everything. The truth is hidden in plain sight, but the moment you dig too deep, they'll close the door forever. Holmes's eyes glinted with defiance. Then I'll make sure they know we're coming. As Holmes and Watson left the cabin, their minds were churning with the weight of the new revelation. The girl had been more than just a messenger. She had been a key figure in a conspiracy far deeper and more dangerous than they could have ever anticipated. The final clue was now clear. They had to find her before those who sought to silence her did, but time was running out. The train's wheels seemed to echo louder in the darkness as it sped toward its next stop. Holmes and Watson sat in silence, the weight of their next steps hanging heavy in the air. The final piece of the puzzle was within reach, but they both knew that uncovering it would come at a cost. They would find the girl. And when they did, the full extent of the conspiracy would be revealed, one that could change the course of history. But would they be able to stop it before it was too late? The tension between Holmes and Watson was palpable as they sat across from each other in their compartment, the train's constant rattle against the tracks the only sound filling the space. Both men were deep in thought, but neither one spoke for some time. They had just learned from Sergei that the girl they had been searching for, perhaps the key to the entire conspiracy, had been central to something far darker and more far-reaching than they could have ever anticipated. And the worst part was, time was running out. The forces against them were closing in, and soon it would be too late to stop what was already in motion. The sky outside was now dark, the stars faint against the blackness of the night. The wind whistled through the cracks of the train, and Watson could feel the weight of the journey pressing down on him. There was a strange foreboding in the air, a sense that things were drawing to a close one way or another. Holmes, as always, seemed to be the calm in the storm. His brow was furrowed, his fingers tapping gently against the armrest of his seat as he studied the faint reflection of himself in the glass. He had not yet spoken, but Watson could tell that his mind was working faster than ever. Finally, Holmes broke the silence, his voice steady but tinged with an edge of urgency. Watson, I've been thinking. Watson looked up from his musings, nodding for Holmes to continue. You've noticed it too, haven't you? Holmes said, his voice almost absent of emotion. The girl. She's been running for a reason, and that reason is more significant than we've been led to believe. Her role in this conspiracy isn't just one of an innocent bystander. She's at the very heart of it. Watson leaned forward. Yes, Holmes, I understand. But what is it about her knowledge that's so dangerous? If the conspiracy is as vast as Sergei said, then surely her disappearance wasn't just an afterthought. There's something more we haven't uncovered yet, something hidden in the shadows. Holmes nodded, his eyes narrowing. Exactly, Watson. We've only seen the surface of this puzzle, and now we must go deeper. The girl's disappearance wasn't the end of the trail. It was the beginning. There's something she knew, something she was supposed to reveal, but we've yet to find out what that is. The train jerked slightly as it entered a station, its bright lights casting fleeting shadows across the tracks. Holmes stood, his eyes narrowing as he made a quick decision. Watson, we can't wait any longer. We need to move. Watson stood at once, sensing the urgency in Holmes's voice. The two men quickly exited the compartment and made their way down the narrow corridor, past rows of passengers still lounging or dozing in their seats. They approached the door to the next car where Holmes paused and turned to Watson with a slight frown. There's someone I need to speak to, Holmes said quietly. Someone who might hold the final piece of this puzzle. Watson raised an eyebrow. Who? Holmes gave him a knowing look. You'll see. They continued down the hallway, the faint murmur of voices growing louder as they neared the dining car. Holmes's pace quickened as he neared a small door at the back of the car. With a swift motion, he pushed it open and led Watson inside. The small room was dimly lit, the scent of freshly brewed coffee lingering in the air. A man was seated at one of the tables near the window, looking out over the darkened landscape as though waiting for something, or someone. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his posture rigid but relaxed. His eyes, however, were hard and calculating as he turned to face them. Holmes wasted no time. Ah, Victor, I trust you've been well. The man Victor stood and extended his hand, his expression tight. "Holmes, I wasn't expecting you." Holmes shook his hand firmly. "You knew I would come. I just didn't know when." Victor gestured for them to sit. "I suppose there's no point in pretending. You're here for the same reason I've been watching the train. To find her." Holmes and Watson sat down, their attention fully focused on Victor. Holmes wasted no time in diving into the matter at hand. "We know she's involved in something far bigger than we initially thought. The girl, the conspiracy. There's something crucial that we've missed, and we need your help to find out what it is." Victor's face hardened as he crossed his arms. "You've been asking the right questions, Holmes. But be careful what you uncover. Some truths are not meant to be discovered." Watson exchanged a glance with Holmes, who was already on the edge of his seat. "What do you mean?" Watson asked. "Why are you so hesitant to tell us everything?" Victor leaned forward, his eyes locking onto theirs. "Because what you're dealing with goes beyond espionage. It's far more dangerous than you realize. The girl was never meant to be found. She was a part of an operation that no one is supposed to know about. An operation that has been in motion for decades." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "What operation? What is it that she knows?" Victor hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously toward the window. "She knew about the red files, a series of documents that could shift the balance of power in Europe. They contain sensitive information about high-ranking officials, political deals, covert operations that, if released, would ruin entire governments. It's not just about money or power. It's about control." Watson sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. "The red files? And the girl? She was the one who had access to them?" Victor nodded grimly. "Yes, but she wasn't the only one who knew. There were others. Powerful men who would do anything to keep those files hidden. They've been chasing her ever since she realized the full extent of what she had stumbled upon." Holmes leaned in, his voice steady. "But why would they let her go? Why not just eliminate her? If she knew so much, why hasn't she been silenced?" Victor's expression darkened. "Because they needed her alive, at least for a while. She was supposed to deliver the files to someone high up in the ranks. But she ran instead, and now they'll stop at nothing to make sure the files never see the light of day." The conversation hung heavily in the air as Watson processed the information. The girl, far more than just a messenger, had been involved in an operation that could change the course of history. The red files contained secrets too dangerous for the world to know, and the people after her were willing to kill to keep them hidden. Holmes's voice broke the silence. "Where is she now, Victor? Do you know?" Victor's eyes shifted uneasily. "I don't, but I know who might. The man who's been tracking her, the one you've seen on the train, he's not just an agent. He's been sent to bring her back. And if he succeeds, it's over." Watson's pulse quickened. "Where is he now?" Victor shook his head, regret filling his eyes. "I don't know. But I do know one thing. If you keep pursuing this, you'll be stepping into a game that's already been decided. The stakes are too high for anyone to interfere. You're better off turning back." Holmes stood abruptly, his voice resolute. "I don't turn back. Not when lives are at stake." Victor didn't argue. He stood as well, his face hard. "Then you're already too far in. But be careful, Holmes. You're walking into the heart of a storm." As Holmes and Watson left the dining car, the weight of Victor's words pressed down on them. The pieces were finally beginning to fall into place, but there was still one crucial element missing: the girl. And with her disappearance, the fate of the red files hung in the balance. Holmes's mind raced as they returned to their compartment. They were close now, closer than ever before, but with each step they took, the danger grew more imminent. The forces behind the conspiracy were closing in, and the girl was the key to everything. But where was she? Holmes glanced out the window at the dark landscape. "Watson," he said quietly, "I have a feeling that the next stop will be the most important one yet. If we're going to find her, we must be ready for whatever comes next." Watson nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. They had come too far to stop now. The truth was just ahead of them, and they would stop at nothing to uncover it. As the train hurtled forward into the night, Holmes's eyes glinted with determination. This was the moment they had been preparing for. The final confrontation was imminent. The game was nearly over, and the stakes had never been higher. But the question remained: who would emerge victorious, and who would pay the ultimate price? The train hurtled through the night, the landscape a blur of dark shadows and fleeting lights. Holmes, Watson, and the rest of the passengers were oblivious to the true storm that loomed just beyond the horizon. Every moment on the train brought them closer to the truth, yet further away from the safety they had once known. Holmes was more certain than ever that the girl, the enigmatic figure at the heart of this mystery, was not just a victim. She was the key to everything. But the final act of this perilous drama was still to unfold. As the train began to slow for its next stop, Holmes stood at the window, his mind racing. Watson, who had been silently pondering the clues they had uncovered, turned to his friend with a mix of impatience and curiosity. "Holmes, what do you think we're about to find? The girl, do you believe she's still alive?" Holmes did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the darkened train station ahead. He could feel the weight of the case closing in, the final moments before the truth would be revealed. "I'm not sure, Watson," he replied quietly, "but we've come too far to turn back now. Whatever happens next, we must face it head on." The train finally came to a halt, its screeching brakes signaling their arrival at a small, isolated station nestled in a thick forest. The air outside was cold, the ground wet from a recent rain. Holmes and Watson stepped off the train, their steps cautious but determined. The station was nearly deserted, save for a few scattered figures, local travelers and one man standing by a waiting carriage watching them closely. Holmes's sharp eyes immediately locked onto the figure. The man was tall with a hard, cold expression that seemed all too familiar. The same man who had been following them, always one step ahead, always watching. "He's here," Watson said quietly, his voice edged with both fear and resolve. Holmes's expression darkened. "Yes, and he's here for the same reason we are, to find her. But the question is, which of us will reach her first?" They moved toward the man, and as they approached, he didn't flinch. His eyes, however, narrowed slightly as he regarded them. "You've made it this far, Holmes," the man said, his voice low but controlled. "But it's over. The girl is already gone. There's nothing more you can do." Holmes's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. "We shall see. The game is not over yet." Without warning, the man turned on his heel, walking briskly toward a small, dimly lit building at the edge of the station. Holmes and Watson exchanged a look, then followed him, moving with purpose but not haste. Inside the building it was eerily quiet, save for the muffled sound of footsteps echoing against the stone walls. The man led them down a narrow hallway to a room at the far end. The door creaked open, and Holmes and Watson stepped inside, their eyes scanning the dimly lit room. And there, sitting in the center, was the girl. She was calm, too calm, and though she looked up at them as they entered, there was no hint of surprise in her eyes. It was as if she had known they would come. Holmes moved forward, his voice gentle but firm. "You're the key to all of this, aren't you? You know what's really going on. You've known it all along." The girl, her face pale but composed, nodded slowly. "I knew what I was involved in. I knew what I had to do. But I didn't know how far they would go to keep their secrets." She looked at the man standing in the corner of the room, who had followed them inside. "He's the one, isn't he?" she said quietly. "The one who's been hunting me." The man's face hardened. "Don't listen to her, Holmes. She's just a piece of the puzzle, nothing more." Holmes, undeterred, turned his gaze back to the girl. "What is it you know?" "What are the red files?" The girl's eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "The red files are everything," she whispered. "They contain records, names, dates, deals that could topple governments, destroy powerful men, and reveal the true extent of corruption in Europe. The people behind this, they'll stop at nothing to keep it hidden." Holmes's mind raced. The pieces were finally falling into place. The girl had been part of a much larger conspiracy, one that stretched across Europe, entangling governments, intelligence agencies, and shadowy figures who had no intention of letting their secrets slip. But why was she so calm now? Why had she given herself up? "Why didn't you run?" Holmes asked, his voice low with curiosity and suspicion. "Why did you come here knowing it was a trap?" The girl met his gaze. "Because running would never have saved me. I couldn't live with the knowledge of what was happening. I had to make a choice, and I chose to stop them before it was too late." Holmes's mind clicked into place. "You weren't just trying to escape. You were trying to expose them." She nodded slowly. "I knew they were watching me. They thought I was dead, an accident, a mistake. But I wanted to make sure the truth came out, no matter what." The silence that followed was heavy with understanding, but also dread. The man in the corner stepped forward, his face cold and resolute. "You think you can stop this? You think you can expose what's been hidden for so long? You have no idea what you're dealing with." Holmes stepped between the girl and the man, his eyes hardening. "I think I know exactly what I'm dealing with." Without warning, the man lunged at Holmes, but Watson reacted instantly, stepping forward and intercepting the attack. The two struggled briefly, and then Watson forced the man back, knocking him against the wall. The man glared at them, his eyes filled with hatred, but he did not move. Holmes turned back to the girl. "You're free now. You don't have to run anymore. But you have to trust us. We'll make sure the truth gets out." The girl looked at him, her eyes filled with both gratitude and sorrow. "It's too late. The people I was running from, they've already made their move. They'll stop at nothing to silence me. They'll stop at nothing to make sure the red files are never seen by the public." Holmes, however, was resolute. "We will make sure the files are exposed. You have my word." Suddenly, there was a loud crash and the door to the room burst open. Several men in dark suits stormed in, their guns drawn. Holmes and Watson immediately fell into defensive positions, but the girl, calm and composed, stood up slowly, her hands raised. "I knew this would happen," she said, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "But I'm ready. I'll make sure the truth comes out even if I don't survive this." Holmes stepped forward, his hand outstretched. "No, you don't have to do this alone. We'll make sure your story is heard." Before the girl could respond, one of the men aimed his gun directly at her. Holmes's hand shot out, grabbing his arm and twisting it violently, sending the weapon clattering to the floor. Watson followed suit, taking down another of the attackers with a quick strike. The battle was swift but intense, and as the last of the assailants was subdued, Holmes turned back to the girl. "This isn't over," Holmes said, his voice firm. "The truth will be exposed. The red files will be released." As the authorities arrived to take control of the situation, Holmes, Watson, and the girl made their escape into the night, the wind howling as they disappeared into the distance. The girl, once a pawn in a dangerous game, was now free to live her life, but the shadows of the past would always remain with her. And for Holmes and Watson, the case had come to an end. But it was not the end of the story. The files had been secured, the truth would be revealed, and the forces behind the conspiracy had been unmasked. Yet, as Holmes reflected on the case, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger game. The girl's redemption had come at a cost, but in the end, justice had prevailed. And Holmes knew that no matter where the next mystery led, he would be ready to face it no matter the cost. This ending brings closure to the investigation, providing a sense of resolution for the girl's fate and the conspiracy, while leaving open the possibility for future adventures for Holmes and Watson. It reflects Holmes's unwavering commitment to truth and justice, despite the dangers that lurk in the shadows.